taken us a while to get here. We've been working on our Lone Star, and now we have all of the parts ready. We have our diamonds constructed, we have our setting triangles cut, and our corner squares cut, and it's time to piece the set-in seams. So this is what it's going to look like. Here is our first section with the 2 diamonds and a setting triangle, and you can see that it's making a Y. That's why they call it the Y seam. So the first thing we need to do is put some marks on here. So on the back, so these 2 diamonds are going to go together. On the back of this diamond, I need to mark a 1/4 inch marking place, a place so that I know where to start and stop. So I'm going to take, in this case, I'm going to take a black pen so that you can really see it. In real life, I probably would use my white pencil. But with this, on the fat side of the diamond, I'm going to draw a mark a 1/4 inch from this edge. You see that? Then I'm going to bring my ruler to the other side and draw a 1/4 inch from that edge. That gives me my starting and stopping point. So that'll make more sense when I get to this step. But before we sew this, I want to show you how we mark our setting triangles and corner squares. So this is a setting triangle. This is where I have to have a mark. I need a mark that is going to be a 1/4 inch from both sides. So on this, because this is actually the top of the quilt, I don't want to make a big mark like I made on my diamonds. I just want to make a dot. So for that, I do like to use my Pitt pen, my permanent India ink, not going to hurt the fabric, isn't going to bleed kind of a pen. And I line up that corner on the ruler, so it's right here at a inch mark, and from here to here is obviously a 1/4 inch, and I'm going to make my mark right here. So it's a 1/4 inch from the left side and a 1/4 inch from the side right in front of me, and you can see that little dot. Now I held it down a little longer than I needed to because I want you to see that dot. So now we're going to put our diamonds together. So I'm going to move my triangle out of the way and get my diamond together. So this is the section. I want to sew this seam together, and here's my mark. I'm going to start sewing on that mark. So that's the first place I'm going to put a pin. Then I need to match up these intersecting seams. I need these all to line up perfectly if you want. I'm thinking that's what I'm trying for anyway. So I'm going to take the fabric and roll it down, and I'm watching that seam as I go. When I get it right in place, put a pin in there. Now I'm going to do it to the next one. Roll it down till it matches up. Pin it. Same thing here. Roll it down till it matches up. Now this is going to be a good teaching moment in easing here. When I did that one, do you see how that top diamond is a little bit bigger than the bottom diamond? That's okay. I'm going to ease that in. That particular seam is on the bias, which means I'm going to be able to very easily ease it in. I'll put a pin right in the middle, and that's all the extra pinning I'll need. When I'm sewing this, because that's bias, it's going to come and just be really, really flat. You won't even know it was an issue. Then I come to my very end, and at the very end, I want to match up my points and put a pin in. Now I'm going to go to the sewing machine and sew this seam. I'm going to start sewing this seam right at that intersection that I made. So you can see the intersection that I made with my ink. That's where I'm going to start sewing. So I like to take my machine and put my needle right down into it before I lower my presser foot, and then I can sew. Oh, I should tell you, I have set my machine up with a smaller than normal stitch length. So I'm set up at a 2.0 stitch length because we're going to press this seam open. Going to sew all the way through, being careful that I'm not flipping up any seams that I have pressed open. I want them just the way they are. This is that one that I talked about that had the little bit of easing to happen. If I take my awl, I can just hold it down as it goes, and it'll ease right in. Nobody will ever know I also, in this case, I have my open toe applique foot on only because I'm hoping it'll make it easier for you to see the needle. As I come to the point, it's really, really, really important that when you come to the point, you don't let the fabric slide out so that you end up with a smaller than normal 1/4 inch seam allowance. If anything, you want to push it in. This is the thing that is going to prevent you from having a mountain in the middle of your Lone Star. When you come to the point, be extra cautious to not go too narrow, but almost go a little bigger than normal. If you do that every time, all of your points will make, with your points all being just a smidge of a bigger seam allowance, you won't have that mountain in the middle. Now we're going to go and press this seam. Just like with all the other seams, I want to press this open. So I'm going to start by setting my seam. Then I'm going to open it and very carefully open up that seam so I can press it open. After I've done it from the back side, I want to do it from the front side too, so I know that it's very crisp. And I'm hoping you can see here where I matched up those seams, where they came together. I was very careful to lay them down one on top of another so that I got that very, very nice, crisp intersection there. Now it's time to put on our setting triangle. When you're getting ready to sew your setting triangles and your setting squares in, you need to remember that you have that opening right there. See how I've got that opening? That's because I started a 1/4 inch below the corner. And I'm going to start sewing on the right hand side. So I'm going to take this right hand diamond and flip it over on top of my triangle. After I've flipped it over, then I can take the left hand side here and just get it over here out of the way. I need to fold this down and shift this fabric to the left and to the right until I can see the dot that I created. Remember that dot that I made on the setting triangle corner? With this folded down, I need to be able to see that dot. So if my awl is the dot, it's right there. The fabric is not covering the dot. It's just right next to it. Then I'm going to pin that in place. And remember when we were doing the math of the triangles, I told you that I on purpose make the triangles and the squares a little bit big. Now you can see that it is. So that's a little bit bigger than it needed to be. And that's good because I'll be able to then square everything up when my star is done. Put a couple of more pins in. And then go to my sewing machine. Now here at the sewing machine, this is where I like to have my acrylic table on the machine. Remember we use the acrylic table when we're doing free motion quilting? And some people like to sew with it all the time there. As a seamstress, I'm not usually wanting to sew with the acrylic table there because I need to use my free arm. I need to have more freedom in my machine to move the garment around. And generally speaking, for most quilt piecing, you don't want it on there either, but it's not a big deal if you do. When it comes time for setting seams, especially on larger diamonds, it is really nice to be able to have this fabric floating on the acrylic table. So I recommend that if possible, you get an acrylic table for this step. I'm going to start sewing on this seam with my scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And as always, I'm going to go right over top of my pins a little bit slower than normal. All right, now I'm coming up to the corner here. With the second part, that second diamond folded down, I can see that dot. That dot is right there. I want to sew until my needle sets right in that dot. It will not be touching, it will not be in the purple fabric. It will be off the purple fabric and it will just be setting into the dot on the light blue fabric. So coming up to it, take your time. and go until you're just in the blue fabric. So I am only in the blue fabric. I am not in the purple fabric at this point. Lift your presser foot and take your pins out of the first set. Oops, I think I lost a pin. There it is. All right. Now unfold that second diamond under the foot. Spin it around. So the next seam I am going to sew is going to be this straight edge of the triangle. I want to spin it around until that seam is straight pointing toward me. Now with my right hand underneath, I'm going to hold that triangle in place as I pivot these diamonds around. This will pivot all the way around until, like magic, it is lined up with that edge that I want to sew. So everything is already lined up. I didn't have to wrestle it at all. The first stitch I take, I want it to be on the diamonds. I want it to be on my purple fabric, so I recommend you do it by hand. Oops, lower your presser foot and make that first stitch right on the diamond, on the purple. Then I can lift it up and do a little bit more adjusting, put some pins in. And continue sewing. Using my awl, I'm always sewing with my awl in my hand. The idea is just to have that third hand to keep those seams in place. And as I come to the end, I'm going to sew all the way off the end and then cut my thread. Coming back to my iron. Here's my section, but I need to press it. And I'm going to press this from the back side, obviously, and I'm going to press it toward the diamonds. I'm not going to, the fabric is telling me it wants to be pressed flat this way, but for a couple of reasons, I'm not going to do that. The first reason is I want it to be pressed toward the star, so on the front side, the star is on top of the background fabric, but more importantly, I want to press it to the star because many times beginners will end up right here in this intersection and they'll have a little hole. Instead of going one stitch off the purple and then one stitch right onto the purple, you might get an extra little stitch in there, and if you do, it kind of creates a little hole. Well, you don't need to worry about it. If you press this seam toward the diamond section, that seam is going to be over the hole. So when you're looking at it from the front side, you won't see a hole right to the batting of your quilt. You will actually see, if there were a hole there, you would see the background fabric. So I've got this setting triangle in place. I'm going to put two of those together and come back and show you the next steps. I have my 2/4 diamonds done, so 2 diamonds with the triangle. This seam is done. So now it's time to set in a square. One thing I do want to point out, with the background fabric that I chose, it is a directional fabric, so I want to be cautious to be sure that my directions are always going the same way. So here you see the lines are going this way, the lines are going this way. In the square, it's going the same way. I want it to look that way when the quilt is done. I need to find my 1/4 inch mark at the middle of this seam so I can make a set in seam. Piecing the Y seam, you want to sew the right hand section first. So I'm going to take that, flip it up on top, and flip this guy out flat. Fold him down and find the dot. Line up the fabric so I'm not covering up the dot. Whoops. Let's go sew that. So this is another set in seam. I'm going to start up there at the top. So this is where I want to stop. I want to stop right at that mark that I made. So I'm only in the blue fabric. I'm not in the purple fabric. Lift my presser foot, take my pins out, and then lift this guy up out of, or lay him flat here, but I need him to be out of the way so that I can spin this around. So there's my square underneath. I know that this is where I need to sew straight off. So with my right hand holding that square in place, I'm going to spin the top section around. And it gets harder and harder the bigger the piece gets, but the idea is always the same. Keep spinning it around until this edge lines up with the straight edge of the square. The first stitch I want to take is on the purple. So let's get him positioned. Take one stitch manually. So I'm right on the purple. Then I can lift my presser foot, maneuver things around. Couple of pins. And sew off this side. Just like before, I'm going to press that seam toward the diamond. Oops. And there it is from the front. Whoops. All right, it's looking pretty good. Now it's time to put the two halves together. So here's one half, and here is the second half. We need to put the two halves together so that we'll be able to do this set-in square. This is the part that scares people, getting these two centers together. So if we look at it from the back side, if you look really carefully, you can see the intersection lines. Here's a seam line that's going here, and a seam line that is going here. That is where it intersects. Then the same thing on the other side. Here's the seam line, and here is the seam line. So these two seam line intersections need to match on the front side. And they need to not make a mountain in the middle of your Lone Star. So if we pick these two up together, take a pin and put it right in that intersection of seam lines. Flip it up. Now I can see the intersection of seam lines on the bottom fabric there. I'm going to put my pin right in the middle. Line it up. Keep that pin straight up and down as you go to grab another pin. And when you're putting this pin in to secure it, don't take it and try and go through all those fabrics. It's just too thick. Instead, take that pin underneath the fabric until it hits the seam line, then take a bite with your pin. That should secure that seam. The rest of the seams are going to be matched up just like we did before. Just picking it up and rolling that fabric down until I match that seam up. And I'm going to do that on every one of these. Oops, you know what I forgot to do? I forgot to mark my starting and stopping point. So let me take my pen. Got to mark my 1/4 of an inch here and 1/4 of an inch there. That'll be my starting point. And this time, it's actually going to have an ending point too. Make my end mark. Now I'm going to go and sew these two halves together. When I'm coming to the middle of this seam, where those intersecting seams were, I want to sew right into that intersection. I have to be really cautious that I don't have too small of a seam allowance. It should be almost a little bit fatter than your normal scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's what's going to keep it from being a mountain in the middle. Right through that seam. This time I'm going to stop where I made my mark. Press this seam open. A lot of fabric there in the middle. You just want to press it completely open, nice and flat. And press it from the front side. Ooh la la. All right, looks pretty good. There's no mountain in the middle of my Lone Star. So I have my two halves together. Now I just need to put in my final two corner squares, and my Lone Star center will be done. When we come back next time, we're going to put some borders on this quilt, and I'm going to show you some quilting options for your Lone Star quilts.